For centuries, the Hazara people have carried one of the most fascinating and debated origin stories in Central and South Asian history. Their distinctive appearance, their Hazaragi language, their historical homeland in the central highlands of Afghanistan, and their connections to the wider populations of Central Asia have led historians and travelers to propose different explanations for where the Hazaras came from. The most famous theory is also the one most people have heard, that the Hazaras are descendants of Mongol armies that entered the region during the age of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. Their name, their appearance, and their location along the historical routes connecting Central Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and South Asia have all contributed to that story. But there's always been a problem with reducing an entire population to one medieval army. Human populations almost never form that simply. Armies move, but so do merchants, farmers, women, families, slaves, refugees, tribal groups, and entire communities. Conquerors can settle in a region without replacing everyone already living there. Small numbers of migrants can have enormous genetic influence if their descendants expand over many generations. And populations can absorb newcomers while preserving large amounts of ancestry from people who were already living there. So when scientists finally began examining Hazara DNA on a large scale, they were not simply asking whether the old Mongol story was true or false. They were asking a much deeper question. What actually happened to the population of the region between Central Asia, Iran, and Afghanistan during the centuries when the Hazara identity was taking shape? One of the most comprehensive genetic studies of Hazaras, published in 2019, analyzed samples from Hazara populations in Afghanistan and Pakistan and compared them with thousands of genetic datasets from populations across Eurasia. The result was striking. The study found that Hazaras carried substantial East Asian ancestry, an estimated approximately 8% Mongolian-related ancestry in its genetic model, strongly supporting a major connection with medieval Mongolian populations. But that was only one part of the result. The same study found that modern Hazaras were genetically closer in several analyses to Turkic-speaking populations, such as Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz, than they were to modern Mongolians themselves. The researchers concluded that the Hazara genetic profile was an East-West Eurasian mixture, formed after the ancestors of modern Hazaras separated from populations associated with the Mongolian world and subsequently mixed with local and neighboring populations. And that is where the real story begins. Because the DNA does not destroy the Mongol origin story, it does something much more interesting. It reveals that the Mongol connection is real, but it is only one layer in a much larger genetic history. The Hazaras are not simply Mongolians who somehow ended up in Afghanistan. They are the descendants of a complex population formed where East Eurasian and West Eurasian worlds collided, mixed, separated, and eventually produced a distinct community in the mountains of Afghanistan. This is the real genetic origin of the Hazara people, and it is considerably more complicated than the story most people have heard. To understand how that happened, you have to go back before the Hazara identity itself existed. The word Hazara refers to a population whose recognizable historical identity emerged in the medieval period. But the people who eventually became Hazaras lived within a region that had already experienced thousands of years of migration. Afghanistan occupies one of the most important geographic crossroads in the entire history of Eurasia. To the north are the Central Asian steppe and the great routes that once connected the populations of modern Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and western China. To the west lies Iran and the Iranian Plateau. To the east are the mountains leading toward the Indus Valley in South Asia. To the south are the ancient routes into the regions that became Pakistan and northern India. There is almost no way to understand the genetic history of a population living in this location without thinking about movement. For thousands of years, people traveled through these mountains and valleys. Some were pastoralists moving with their herds. Some were merchants following the great Silk Road networks. Some were soldiers serving distant empires. Some were settlers looking for land. Others were refugees escaping wars and political upheaval. The populations of this region were therefore never genetically isolated from the rest of Eurasia. Long before the Mongols appeared, the peoples of Afghanistan already carried ancestry from multiple ancient populations. Ancient Iranian-related populations, Central Asian groups, South Asian populations, and later steppe-associated peoples all contributed to the genetic landscape of the region at different points in history. The Hazara story, therefore, did not begin when Mongol armies arrived. The Mongol period was a major chapter in a much older demographic story. This distinction is essential because otherwise the genetic evidence can easily be misunderstood. When researchers identify Mongolian-related ancestry in modern Hazaras, they are not saying that the entire population suddenly appeared in the 13th century. They are identifying one major ancestral contribution that became incorporated into a population with much older West Eurasian and Central Asian roots. The 2019 study itself described the modern Hazara profile as an East-West Eurasian admixed population and emphasized genetic connections to both East Asian and Central Asian populations. In other words, the DNA tells us that the Hazara story is not a single arrow pointing from Mongolia toward Afghanistan. It is a network of arrows moving in several directions. The first major clue comes from the East Asian component itself. For decades, historians and anthropologists had noticed that many Hazaras possess physical characteristics that distinguish them from many neighboring populations in Afghanistan. These observations contributed to the idea that their ancestors must have come from Eastern Central Asia. But appearance alone cannot tell us precisely where a population came from. Similar physical features can evolve independently, and populations can acquire different appearances after mixing with neighboring groups. Genetics provides a much stronger tool because it allows scientists to compare patterns of ancestry across thousands or millions of DNA variants. When researchers compared Hazaras with populations from across Eurasia, they found a clear East Asian genetic signal. The 2019 study found that Hazaras shared more alleles with East Asian populations than many other Central Asian populations did, and its admixture modeling estimated that about 8% of their ancestry in the tested model was Mongolian-related. That is a major result. It means the old idea that the Hazaras have a substantial connection to the Mongol world was not simply a legend created from appearance or historical speculation. There is real genetic evidence behind it, but now comes the part that makes the story more complicated. If Hazaras were simply descendants of Mongolian settlers who moved into Afghanistan, you might expect modern Hazaras to cluster most closely with modern Mongolians, yet the study found something different. In several analyses, Hazaras were genetically closer to Turkic-speaking populations, such as Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Kyrgyz, than to modern Mongolians. That does not mean Hazaras are simply Turkic people. It means the East Eurasian ancestry inside the Hazara population has a broader Central Asian history than the word Mongolian alone can capture. The Mongol Empire was itself a vast political and demographic system containing many different peoples. Mongolian armies incorporated Turkic-speaking groups, Central Asian nomads, and populations from across the steppe. Soldiers and administrators moved across enormous distances. Communities that had previously been separate were brought into contact. Some of those people settled permanently in conquered territories. So the genetic legacy of the Mongol period cannot necessarily be reduced to one modern population called Mongolian. The genetic signal may reflect a mixture of populations that lived within and around the Mongol imperial world. This is why the Hazara result is simultaneously a confirmation and a correction of the traditional story. Yes, there is substantial Mongolian-related ancestry, but the population that carried that ancestry into Afghanistan was part of a much larger Central Asian world. And this brings us directly to the 13th century, one of the most transformative periods in Eurasian history. In the early 1200s, Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan, united many Mongol and steppe groups and began a series of conquests that would transform Eurasia. The Mongol expansion moved westward with astonishing speed. Central Asia was conquered. Major cities were attacked. Political systems collapsed and were replaced. Populations were displaced. New military settlements were established. And Afghanistan became one of the regions deeply affected by the Mongol conquest. The Mongol invasion was not simply a military event, it was a demographic event. Armies moved into conquered territories, and some soldiers and their descendants remained. Captured populations were relocated. Administrators, craftsmen, merchants, and military families moved along the imperial networks. The genetic consequences of such a transformation would not necessarily appear immediately. They would emerge over generations as migrants married local populations. Their descendants became established. This is one reason the timing of Hazara admixture is so important. The genetic evidence is broadly consistent with a medieval Central Asian contribution occurring around the period of Mongol expansion. But genetics cannot identify a single individual called Genghis Khan as the father of an entire population. That distinction matters. Popular ancestry stories often compress centuries of population history into one famous ancestor. Science rarely allows that kind of certainty. A genetic population can show ancestry associated with a historical population without proving descent from one specific ruler. The 2019 study supports substantial Mongolian-related ancestry, but its conclusion is that Hazaras experienced admixture with local and neighboring populations and subsequently developed an East-West Eurasian genetic profile. That is a much more realistic model of ethnogenesis. It suggests that the Hazara population formed through a process rather than through a single founding event. Mongol-related groups contributed ancestry. Local populations contributed ancestry. Central Asian populations contributed ancestry. And over time, those layers became the population we now recognize as Hazara. The geography of the Hazara homeland makes this process even easier to understand. The central highlands of Afghanistan, historically associated with Hazarajat, are not an open steppe where large populations could move freely without encountering geographic barriers. The region is mountainous, rugged, and divided by high passes and valleys. Such terrain can have a powerful effect on population genetics. Mountains can slow migration, valleys can become isolated communities. Once a population settles in a mountainous region, generations of marriage within the community can preserve a distinctive genetic profile, even while the population maintains ancient ancestry from several different sources. This may help explain why the Hazara genetic signature is so recognizable today. Their ancestors may have been created through admixture during periods of large-scale movement, but later isolation helped preserve that mixture. In other words, migration may have created the population structure, while geography helped maintain it. This pattern is common in human history. A population can be genetically mixed at its formation and relatively isolated afterward. The result is a community that carries ancestry from multiple distant populations, but still appears genetically distinct from all of them. The Hazaras fit this model remarkably well. They contain strong East Eurasian ancestry, but they are not simply East Asian. They contain West Eurasian ancestry, but they are not simply Iranian or Central Asian. They share connections with Turkic-speaking populations, but that does not make them identical to Uyghurs, Kazakhs, or Kyrgyz. Their genetic identity emerged from the particular combination of these ancestral streams in a particular geographic environment. This is why the phrase Mongolian descent is simultaneously useful and incomplete. It identifies a major part of the ancestry, but does not explain the entire population. The West Eurasian side of the story is just as important as the East Asian side. If you looked only at the physical characteristics of many Hazaras, you might focus on their East Asian-associated features and assume that their ancestry must be overwhelmingly Eastern. But the genetic evidence shows a different picture. Hazaras possess substantial West Eurasian ancestry as well, which reflects the populations that were already present across Afghanistan and neighboring regions and the additional groups that moved through the area over centuries. Afghanistan has always been positioned between Central Asia and the Iranian world, and populations associated with the Iranian Plateau contributed heavily to the genetic history of the region. Persian-speaking and Iranian-related populations lived across large parts of Afghanistan and surrounding territories long before the emergence of the modern Hazara identity. There were also populations connected to South Asia, especially in the eastern and southern regions of Afghanistan and across the Indus frontier. When Mongol and Central Asian groups entered the region, they therefore encountered populations with deep local ancestry. The genetic result was not a replacement of one population by another, it was admixture. This is exactly what the 2019 study's description of the Hazaras as an East-West Eurasian admixed population captures. And once you understand that, the traditional question changes. Instead of asking, are Hazaras Mongols or Afghans? The scientifically meaningful question becomes, which ancient populations contributed to the formation of modern Hazaras, and when did those contributions occur? That question has a far more interesting answer. The Hazaras carry an East Eurasian genetic legacy associated strongly with Mongolian-related ancestry, combined with West Eurasian ancestry, inherited from populations already established in the region, and neighboring Central Asian populations that interacted with them. There's another reason the Turkic connection matters. The medieval and early modern history of Central Asia was not divided neatly into Mongols on one side and everyone else on the other. The Mongol Empire itself gradually transformed as Mongol ruling groups entered and absorbed the cultures and populations of the regions they conquered. In Central Asia, many Mongol elites adopted Turkic languages and became part of Turkic-speaking political societies. The Chagatai world is a major example of this broader transformation. Over time, the distinction between Mongol and Turkic populations became increasingly complicated. Political identity, language, ancestry, and culture did not always move together. A person could descend partly from Mongol ancestors while speaking a Turkic language. A population could inherit Central Asian ancestry from several groups without being directly descended from one modern nation. And an empire could leave a genetic legacy that survives in populations whose modern culture looks very different from that of the people who originally carried the ancestry. This broader history helps explain why the Hazara genetic profile has such strong affinity with Turkic-speaking Central Asian populations. The 2019 study specifically found present-day Hazaras genetically closer in its comparative analyses to Uyghur, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz populations in northwestern China than to Mongolians. This does not erase the Mongolian component. It reveals the Central Asian environment through which that ancestry traveled. The genetic story is therefore not Mongol versus Turkic. It is a history of interaction between populations that were themselves changing. And then there's the question everyone wants answered. Were the Hazaras actually descended from Genghis Khan? This is where we have to separate a compelling historical tradition from what genetics can actually demonstrate. The existence of substantial Mongolian-related ancestry among Hazaras makes a medieval Mongol contribution highly plausible and strongly supported. But proving descent from Genghis Khan himself would require something much more specific. Scientists would need authenticated genetic material from the historical individual, and a statistically robust demonstration that a particular lineage in modern Hazaras descends directly from him. No responsible genetic study should turn a population-level ancestry estimate into a claim that millions of descendants came from one famous ruler. Even when a population has a high proportion of ancestry associated with a historical group, that does not identify the exact individuals responsible. Medieval conquerors often had enormous numbers of descendants, but ancestry from an empire is not the same thing as ancestry from its founder. The most defensible scientific statement is therefore that Hazaras possess substantial ancestry, related to populations associated with the Mongolian world, and that this ancestry likely became incorporated during the period of Mongol expansion and subsequent Central Asian movements. The 2019 study's approximately 57, 8% Mongolian-related estimate is striking, but it should be interpreted as a model-dependent ancestry estimate, not as a literal statement that 57. 8% of every Hazara person's ancestors were Mongolians. Population genetic percentages describe similarity to reference populations under particular models. They are not family tree percentages. This distinction is often lost online, where ancestry results are treated like precise genealogical invoices. Human ancestry is more complicated than that. The most fascinating part of the Hazara story may therefore be what happened after the initial admixture. Once a mixed population became established in the Central Highlands, social identity began to reinforce genetic identity. Communities that shared language, religion, geography, and marriage networks were more likely to marry one another. Over generations, this created a recognizable genetic population. This is the same general process scientists observe in many isolated or endogamous communities around the world. The original population may be formed from several ancestral sources, but later marriage patterns can preserve the combination. That means the genetic identity of modern Hazaras is not simply the DNA of medieval Mongol soldiers. It is the result of everything that happened after those people arrived. Local marriages changed the ancestry proportions. Population growth changed which lineages became common. Geographic isolation reduced outside gene flow. Political upheaval caused migrations. Later movements into Pakistan and Iran created additional regional differences. Communities that left Hazarajat did not necessarily remain genetically identical to communities that stayed. This is why Hazara. Populations in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran should not automatically be assumed to have exactly the same genetic profile. They share a common historical foundation, but their later environments were different. Migration and intermarriage continued to shape them. Pakistan adds another layer to this story. Hazara communities in Pakistan are historically connected to the wider Hazara population of Afghanistan, but their genetic history also reflects their later settlement within South Asia. The 2019 study included Hazara samples from both Afghanistan and Pakistan, allowing researchers to examine their genetic relationship within a broader Eurasian framework. Pakistan itself sits at another major genetic crossroads, where Central Asian, Iranian, and South Asian ancestries meet. Hazara communities living there therefore exist within a region that has experienced its own long history of migration and admixture. This means that modern Hazara ancestry cannot be separated completely from the wider demographic history of the region. A population does not carry only the ancestry of its distant founding event. It carries the consequences of every generation that follows. This is why the idea of a pure Hazara genetic profile is misleading. The Hazaras are distinctive, but distinctiveness does not require purity. In fact, their distinctiveness appears to have emerged precisely because different ancestral streams came together and then became relatively isolated. The genetic evidence also provides a powerful lesson about physical appearance. The Hazara are often immediately recognizable to outsiders because many individuals have facial features associated with East Asian ancestry. Historically, travelers and anthropologists use these features to speculate about their origins. Modern genetics shows that those observations were pointing toward something real, but appearance alone could never reveal the full story. A population can preserve visible traits from one ancestral source while carrying substantial ancestry from several others. Genetic admixture is not always visible in a simple way. Two people can carry similar proportions of East and West Eurasian ancestry, but look noticeably different. Conversely, people who look very different can share substantial ancestry. Human appearance is influenced by a relatively small number of genetic regions compared with the enormous amount of DNA used to estimate population ancestry. The Hazara therefore demonstrate why modern population genetics is more informative than old racial classifications. The old question was, do Hazaras look Mongolian? The modern question is, Which populations contributed ancestry to the Hazara gene pool, and how did those contributions change over time? The second question has an answer that can actually be tested, and that answer keeps bringing us back to the same surprising conclusion. The Hazaras are neither simply Mongolian nor simply local Afghan. They are an East-West Eurasian population whose distinctive identity emerged through admixture. The Mongolian-related contribution is substantial enough that it cannot be dismissed as a minor historical accident. The Central Asian world was itself complex. The West Eurasian component is also substantial enough that the population cannot be reduced to an Eastern Central Asian origin. The affinity with Turkic-speaking populations shows that the ancestry associated with the Central Asian world was itself complex. And the local ancestry demonstrates that the people who were already living in the region contributed significantly to the population that eventually became Hazara. The result is a genetic mosaic. Not a broken one, not an incomplete one. A mosaic created by history. There's also a broader lesson here about the Mongol Empire itself. Popular culture often imagines the Mongols as a single, genetically uniform people spreading across Eurasia. But the empire was enormous, and its armies and populations were diverse. Mongol rulers incorporated Turkic tribes, Iranian populations, Chinese populations, Central Asian communities, and people from many other regions. As the empire expanded, people moved across its territories in unprecedented numbers. The genetic consequences were therefore equally diverse. A population that carries Mongolian-related ancestry today does not necessarily descend from people who lived in Mongolia proper. It may descend from groups that were incorporated into Mongol military or political systems and then moved westward. This is why the Hazara genetic profile is so fascinating. It is a biological record of the Mongol world's expansion and transformation. It preserves an East Eurasian signal, but that signal exists inside a population whose other ancestry points toward the Iranian and Central Asian world. In a sense, the Hazara genome records the moment when two enormous historical zones collided, the East Asian and Central Asian steppe world moving westward, and the ancient populations of Afghanistan and the Iranian Plateau that were already there. But there is one thing the DNA cannot tell us, and that is whether genetic ancestry alone defines Hazara identity. It does not. A population's identity is built from much more than ancestry. Language matters, religion matters, geography matters, shared historical experiences matter, collective memory matters, political institutions matter, families and communities matter. The Hazara identity that exists today was shaped by centuries of history, including experiences that have nothing to do with the percentage of Mongolian-related ancestry in a genome. Genetics can explain part of how the population formed, but it cannot explain what it means to be Hazara. This distinction is especially important because genetic research can easily be misused to reduce living communities to biological categories. The purpose of population genetics is not to tell people what they are allowed to call themselves. It is to reconstruct population history using measurable evidence. In the Hazara case, that evidence tells us that a major East Eurasian contribution is real, that the Mongol connection is scientifically supported, and that the final population emerged through extensive admixture with local and neighboring populations. The DNA explains the ancestry. It does not replace the identity, and there is still much that scientists do not know. The 2019 study was comprehensive for its time, but population genetics is constantly changing as new reference populations and ancient genomes become available. The exact ancestral populations that contributed to modern Hazaras are not identical to modern Mongolians, modern Uyghurs, modern Kazakhs, or modern Afghans. Modern populations have themselves changed over the centuries. Therefore, when scientists say Mongolian-related, they mean that a genetic component is most closely modeled using certain reference populations or ancient ancestry sources. It does not necessarily mean that the ancestors were identical to today's Mongolian population. Likewise, a genetic connection with Turkic-speaking populations does not automatically mean that the ancestors spoke a Turkic language. Language can change without massive genetic replacement, just as ancestry can move without language moving with it. This is one of the most important lessons from human population history. Genes, language, culture, and political identity can travel at different speeds. Sometimes they move together, sometimes they do not. That is why the Hazara story is ultimately more remarkable than the simple claim that they are descendants of Mongols. If that were the entire story, it would still be historically fascinating. But the DNA shows something much larger. It shows a population formed where multiple worlds met. The East Eurasian ancestry is real. The Mongolian connection is real. The Central Asian connections are real. The West Eurasian ancestry is real. And the admixture between these populations is what produced the distinctive genetic profile of the Hazaras. Their ancestors were not simply one army marching into an empty landscape. They were people entering a populated region, interacting with communities that had their own deep histories, and eventually becoming part of a new population whose identity would develop over centuries. The mountains of Hazarajat then helped preserve that mixture, creating a community whose genetic signature remains recognizable today. So, what did scientists really discover? They discovered that the old Mongol origin story was not completely wrong. In fact, one of its central claims is supported by modern genetics. Hazaras carry a substantial amount of Mongolian-related ancestry, and the genetic evidence strongly supports a major East Eurasian contribution to their formation. But they also discovered that Mongolian is not the end of the story. Hazaras are genetically closer in several analyses to certain Turkic-speaking Central Asian populations than to modern Mongolians, and their overall ancestry is best understood as an East-West Eurasian mixture created through admixture with local and neighboring populations. That means the real genetic origin of the Hazaras is not one tribe, one army, or one famous conqueror. It is the result of several populations coming together during one of the most dramatic periods of Eurasian history, and then evolving into a distinct community in the mountains of Afghanistan. And perhaps that is the most important thing hidden inside the Hazara DNA. For centuries, people have tried to answer the question of where the Hazaras came from with a single word: Mongols. But genetics asks for a much longer sentence. It asks us to imagine Central Asian populations moving across the mountains, Mongol-related groups expanding westward, Turkic-speaking peoples interacting with them, local populations contributing their own ancestry, and later generations becoming increasingly connected through geography, marriage, language, religion, and shared history. The result was not a population that was simply transported from one place to another. It was a new population formed through contact. That is how human populations have been created throughout history. They are not static containers of ancient blood. They are living mixtures of people who met one another at different points in time. The Hazara genome, therefore, tells a story that is much bigger than the Hazara themselves. It tells us something about the Mongol Empire, about Central Asian migration, about Afghanistan's position between Eurasia and South Asia, and about the way human identities emerge from centuries of movement. It reminds us that borders are temporary, languages can change, religions can spread, empires can disappear, and political identities can be transformed, while ancestry continues to preserve fragments of what happened long before the modern world existed. The DNA does not remember Genghis Khan as a person. It does not carry a historical label saying him Mongol or Afghan. What it carries are patterns inherited from countless ancestors who lived, moved, married, survived, and disappeared into later generations. Some of those ancestors came from populations associated with the Mongol world. Others were already living in the lands that became Afghanistan. Others were connected to the wider Central Asian and Iranian world. Their descendants eventually became the Hazaras. So the real genetic origin of the Hazara people is not a simple story of outsiders conquering insiders. It is a story of convergence. East met west. Steppe met a mountain. Mongol-related ancestry met older Central Asian and West Eurasian populations. Different communities mixed, and then geography and social networks helped preserve the result. The 2019 genetic evidence gives us a powerful window into that process, with its estimate of 57. 8% Mongolian-related ancestry, and its finding that Hazaras are genetically close to several Turkic-speaking Central Asian populations, while still carrying a substantial West Eurasian component. Future research, especially studies using larger whole genome samples and ancient DNA from the regions involved, will almost certainly make the story even more detailed. Scientists may eventually be able to identify more precisely which Central Asian populations contributed to the Hazara gene pool when different admixture events occurred, and how the ancestry changed between communities in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. But the broad picture is already difficult to ignore. The Hazaras did not emerge from one pure bloodline. They emerged from history itself. Their DNA preserves the legacy of an empire that once stretched across continents, but it also preserves the ancestry of the people who were already living in the region. It records movement, mixture, isolation, and survival. And perhaps that is why the real genetic story is more remarkable than the legend. The legend gives the Hazaras one origin. The genome gives them many. It shows that their identity was not created by a single ancestor standing at the beginning of a family tree, but by generations of people whose histories collided and eventually became inseparable. The Mongol connection is real, but it is not the whole story. The deeper truth is that the Hazara people are a living genetic bridge between the Eastern Eurasian steppe and the ancient populations of Central and South Asia. A population created not by one migration, but by the long, complicated process through which human beings have always become one another's descendants.